We received a piece of listener mail. It says this: I love your show. I haven't listened to all of them, so perhaps you've already discussed this, but my question is, I don't understand how you can tell who has made a payment to you if you publish a Bitcoin address and use it for all incoming sales / tips / donations or whatever. If I set up a website and post a Bitcoin address for people to pay me and several other people make purchases, how can I tell them apart and know who did and who didn't pay? This is something that we came up against pretty early in trying to figure out how we wanted to handle tips on the show. And after some initial experiments using, first we just had a general address, then we just had addresses that were specific. We would basically generate a new Bitcoin address and a new Litecoin address for every time we put out a piece of content. Basically, you can't tell on a person-to-person basis which donation goes to which person unless they specifically contact you to tell you.
Well, even if they contact you to tell you, they could be lying. If you get a tip, you can tell where the tip came from as far as which Bitcoin address it came from. However, you don't know who as a person is attached to that Bitcoin address unless maybe they've published it publicly or something like that, but that's pretty rare. So yeah, like you said, Adam, you really can't tell. And even if somebody did say, hey, I sent you a tip at 12:02 p.m. and this was how much I sent you, they could just be looking at the blockchain and seeing that information because that's public. You don't really have any way to actually verify that they were the one who sent that tip. It would become a problem if you were, for instance, trying to sell a product and you wanted to be able to verify that a certain person made a specific payment to an address, which is why when people sell things, typically what they do is generate a new address for each customer in each sale so that they know that the payment is coming from a specific customer because they're the only one who has that address to pay to.
And there's three ways to really do that. The first way is to pre-generate a whole bunch of addresses and store both the public and private key somewhere, put them in a database, and then issue one for every transaction or for every sale or for every piece of content you want to sell. That's really cumbersome because then you have to track all of these private keys. A slightly better way is to use a type 2 deterministic wallet, such as the one in Electrum with a master public key. And then essentially you have one private key, and then you generate a whole bunch of addresses from the public key. And then you can unlock those with a single private key. It makes the management a bit easier and more predictable. The third approach would be a new one, which is to use BIP32 hierarchical deterministic wallets. And there you can have on your web server, for example, a public extended key that generates infinite numbers of public keys, all of which are related to a single set of private keys that you can generate on a separate machine. So there's ways around this, but essentially the primary practice is to assign a unique address, not just to every piece of content, but potentially to every transaction, and then track that, either by keeping some metadata in a database or by generating in a deterministic fashion, so that when the payment comes in, you can then say, okay, I got this payment on this address, and because I only gave this address for this piece of content and user, I know who it was from.
So basically, there are a lot of approaches you can take to it, but the more control you want to have and the more you want to be able to tell who is sending what, basically it gets a little bit more complicated as you go. But Andreas, when we have hierarchical deterministic wallets as something that is kind of standard in wallet applications, this should become a kind of easier problem, right?
It becomes a lot easier because you can essentially put only a public key on the web server, not risking any of your private keys. However, what's difficult is trickling back the payments from the temporary addresses to more permanent storage. So you have to do some kind of payment processing. But yes, it's a lot easier than trying to generate and keep track of multiple private keys, where if you had a database loss or crash and you lose those keys, there's no way to regenerate them. And at that point, you've lost the payments that went to them. So there's a very big risk there too. Hierarchical deterministic wallets will make this a lot easier.
So we had a little back and forth with this listener who asked that question, which is a great question. I think a lot of people wonder about, by the way. His next question, sort of to follow up on that, was, okay, so how do you generate new addresses for each transaction? It seems kind of cumbersome to do that. And Andreas, you answered that question very nicely. But if you're a merchant and you want to easily, accept Bitcoin for payment for your products that you're selling online, there are a few services that have, you can sign up with them as a merchant, and then they have an API which you can add to your website that automatically does that for you, so that when the customer checks out, they're taken to a page where they're shown a Bitcoin address that is unique to them, and it's different for every customer and every order. And then payment system knows that once Bitcoin comes into that address, it has to be from that customer because they're the only one who saw it. So there's no need to do that manually. There's some services that do that, and two of them are BitPay and Payzius, and there's other ones too coming out all the time.
Yeah, I would add to that Coinbase, who also offer a merchant service, BIPS, which is a European service for those who don't have US bank account, BIPS, and also blockchain.info has an extensive API that can do aliasing and forwarding and be used in such a fashion. So there's a range of options depending on how much control you want and also how much you want done for you.
His very last question was he basically saw something in Wired magazine that freaked him out about smartphones. And that was this program that essentially sends all of the keystrokes that happen on smartphones to some place in the ether, and it can't be turned off. And so he saw a video about this and he was like, well, I don't really like this so much. I think I'm kind of freaked out and I don't want to use a smartphone. So he was wondering if there's any way to use Bitcoin on a dumb phone or a conventional cell phone, like a little flip phone. There is a way actually to send or receive Bitcoins by SMS, which is Coinapult. And if you go to coinapult.com, you can find out how to do that. You can send Bitcoin to a phone number or a email address that way.
Also, if that phone has a browser of any kind, both Coinbase and BitPay have web accessible and even mini mobile browser accessible payment screens where you can generate invoices or payment requests for people to pay you. And I've seen that in use, for example, in a restaurant. But so if you had a dumb phone, you could use a browser to access those services.
Last week, I spoke with Pele Brandgaard of Capochi Wallets. So if you're outside the United States, that's a system that works quite well on dumb phones.
Was this the one that was tied to M-Pesa?
Yes, this is the one that integrates with M-Pesa, but it's not actually tied to M-Pesa. That's just one of the connections into and out of it. Basically, they hide almost all of the complexity from the users and instead just make it so that the interface looks very similar to M-Pesa, and you can receive to your phone number and send to your to other people's phone numbers. And Bitcoin addresses are essentially aliased to those phone numbers.
If I showed you a website where you could easily purchase electronics from the world's largest distributor with Bitcoins at 0% markup, would you think it was too good to be true? Good news, it's real, and it's at bitcoinstore.com. Choose from 500,000 items, save money over Amazon and Newegg, and convert your Bitcoins to real-world items. You can even buy with privacy. All they need is a shipping address. But don't take my word for it. See for yourself at bitcoinstore.com.